הרדיו הבינתחומי בשידורים חיים ורעיונות מיוחדים. מהכנס השנתי של ICT, המכון למדיניות נגד טרור.
I'm Edan Landau from the ICT, and I'm here with Professor Laurie Blank, clinical professor of law and director of International Humanitarian Law Clinic in Emory Law School, United States of America, and Professor Geoffrey, professor of law and presidential research professor, South Texas College of Law, United States of America. How are you this morning?
Very well. Thank you for having us.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
It's a pleasure. I would like to discuss with you, I'll just jump right into it, the Geneva Convention, recent operations. Do you think that today's environment, today's battles, new battlefields, are adapted to the law, or the other way around? Are the laws actually adapted to the new battlefields?
I think that today's conflicts, although we tend to hear that they show us the weaknesses in the law and the need for updates, I think they show us the necessity of the law most of all. This is a law that is designed to accomplish multiple purposes at one time, to enable militaries to fight effectively, to protect civilians during conflict, to mitigate suffering during conflict. And it's precisely in situations of complex battles, densely populated areas, that we see exactly why the law is so essential. It has provisions designed to require forces to distinguish between those who are fighting and those who are not, to take measures to mitigate civilian suffering, all at the same time that recognizing that this is war and deadly force is going to be used. And I think rather than say it's antiquated, I think it reinforces the necessity of continuing to study and think about how to implement it as effectively as possible.
You said something in the beginning, militaries, but the new conflicts, if you look at Protective Edge that we just had here in Israel, it was a military against a non-military organization. It does have its military abilities, but it's not exactly a military. It's more individuals taking up arms. They don't have tanks. They don't have an air force. Their weapons are simple, deadly yet simple. It's difficult for an army, any army in the Western world, not even Western world, even in China, North Korea, talking about the bad guys, of course, but it's still, those are militaries. When you come to combating someone who's not a military, it changes, because he's going to do anything he can in order not to be killed, because he knows that he's in a disadvantage.
It's not as new as we like to suggest. It's more complicated, but the law that regulates the use of combat power has to be universal in its application. The frustration, I think, from an external perspective, is that it produces a double standard. And that's a reality. The reality is that modern armed forces who have to fight these type of what military people and strategic thinkers call asymmetrical threats, right? An enemy that doesn't follow the rules the way you're required to follow the rules, it's perceived as unfair. But it's essential, because if you didn't have these rules, it would be a race to the proverbial bottom. What's the solution? That when you're fighting an enemy that doesn't follow the rules the way you do, that you're released from your obligation to try and mitigate the suffering of war? That can't be the right solution. And in my view, sometimes I think we get too wrapped up in the law and questions about whether the law really is effective in dealing with this, because this law has emerged from military practice. Its origins are with military commanders, many of whom in years gone by had to fight similar asymmetric threats. What they understood was that even when you're fighting an enemy that makes it hard to figure out who he is, even that when you're fighting an enemy that uses the civilian population to cloak his vital assets, even when you're fighting an enemy that doesn't make it easy for you to distinguish him from the civilian population, you have got to impose the constraints and restraints on your own forces. Otherwise, they're going to lose the distinction between moral and immoral fighting and killing. And that's that can't be the ultimate outcome. Then you're not fighting for principles anymore. You're just fighting to win. So if you think of, I've said before, you can imagine hypotheticals where I say there's a kind of outlaw group across your border, and it's conducting raids into your territory, and the area where it's functioning is really kind of lawless. So the state has no choice other than to launch kind of a punitive raid across the border to try and go after these people. I mean, you could say that's Afghanistan. You could say that's Gaza. You could also say it's Mexico in 1917 or 1916 when the U.S. sent an expedition across the border to go after Pancho Villa. These are not totally new threats. The consistency has to be the effort to do your best. It's more complicated to apply the law, but because it's complicated cannot be a license to ignore it.
One other point is that it's important to note that international law does require that these non-state groups, however they characterize themselves, whether we call them terrorists, whatever, organized armed groups, rebel armies, whatever we call them, they're bound to apply and adhere to international law. The fact that they don't do so doesn't mean they don't have to, and it doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to reinforce and emphasize and try to enforce in, judicial proceedings, whatever mechanisms possible, to make sure that little by little they do in some way. We see efforts to train non-state armed groups. We see at multiple tribunals and in domestic courts proceedings to hold them accountable and to reinforce that they are bound by the law. It's not just states. We're not talking about an asymmetry of obligation. We're talking about an asymmetry of implementation.
Although I think the law acknowledges that there will often be asymmetries in compliance. And it's very specific that if you're fighting an enemy that's not following the rules, you are not released from your obligation. Because in the end, the victim of that becomes the innocent person that's caught in the crosshairs.
Well, they'll always be the victims at the end of the day,
Right.
the innocent. I have a few things that come to mind from what you just said. One of them, if we go into the tribunals, even if you look at the special tribunal to Lebanon, it's the first time I think that actual terrorists are on trial for in an international court. Yet they're individuals and they're not an organization. And that, I think, is one of the problems that Israel, for example, has with combating terrorism, because yes, the other side is obligated to follow the rules, but there's nothing to actually make him follow the rules. And that's one of the big problems. They know that they're already persecuted by a certain country, a certain enemy for them that's an enemy. What's another tribunal for them? So there's nothing. There's nothing actually to prevent them from going against humanitarian law or any other law.
I think that's the nature of contemporary state versus non-state warfare. That there are that the deterrent effect of the law isn't really going to influence the conduct of a group that is already decided that it's going to use every means it can, which oftentimes is exploiting the other side's respect for the law to gain some type of advantage. But again, that boils down to the fundamental question, why does the law matter? If the only purpose of the law is to gain reciprocal compliance, then you would say, well, then it doesn't make sense for us to follow the law, because no matter what we do, they're not going to, we give warnings, they're never going to give warnings. We try and evacuate civilians, they're never going to try and evacuate. So why should we do it? And I think the answer is because it's about more than just gaining compliance from your opponent. It's about protecting the integrity of your own forces. Because when they're asked to do this very brutal endeavor, right, the line between morality and immorality is very hard to discern. And the rules are almost like a life preserver that they can cling to navigate this moral challenge. So when they come out the other end, and especially here, they're going back to be your neighbors, your sons, your daughters, whatever the case may be, your friends. They've got to live with the consequences of their decisions. If you take the rules away from them, if you take a normative framework away from them and say you're fighting an enemy that doesn't care about the rules, do whatever you want, that's going to lead to outcomes that are going to be very difficult to live with in the long run, I think. And I think military commanders have always intuitively understood this. They might not have articulated it in the language of the law. They would have articulated it in the language of effective discipline and responsible leadership.
I think that from what I've been hearing in the media, a lot of the commanders are speaking out. The problem is not the rules that are preventing you from just doing whatever you want. That's okay. I think everybody agrees by that. We do have our own code, what's considered an order that you mustn't fulfill, and it's illegal. It's beyond an illegal order.
Right.
We call it an order with a black flag over it. I think the main complaint is that we're held to a standard that we can't stand by. We can't actually fulfill, because if we go into a combat situation, and as much as we try, civilians will always get killed, especially with the new urban warfare. We're held to that account even more than the other side, and it kind of prevents a country, I mean a Western, a democratic, law-abiding country, from protecting its citizens. And it's I think that's one of the requests, is that there will be an adaptation of the law. If you look at criminal law, has always been adapted. Search and seizures, they're always adapted to newer times. And they've implemented new computer laws to adapt to new times. So isn't it time for that as well? And,
I think it's not that when you say being held to a higher standard, that's a political and a media and a consequence of international discourse and commentary. It's not the law. The law definitely sets a high standard for conduct, but it does set the same standard for every participating group, whether it's a state or whatever you call the non-state entity. The challenge here for Israel in these conflicts is that the way that standard is communicated, the way it's interpreted, is so colored by so many other political and cultural and other components of the broader discourse about Israel, about the nature of its conflicts, that it appears to be a higher standard. It appears to be a standard that can't be met. So I think one of the challenges is in communicating effectively about the law, about a better discourse in the international community, because it is described in a way that is an impossible standard. And we see the consequences. Look back to the United States when it announced that it had produced 0 civilian casualties with drone strikes. It's evident that that's not a true statement. So apart from that, what are the consequences of saying we've produced 0 civilian casualties? The consequences is creating a standard that 0 casualties is the appropriate measure by which to judge the legality, the morality, the ethics, the justifiability of the drone strikes. In fact, that's not a standard that comes from the law at all. But it changes the nature of the conversation. And I think that's really the challenge. It's not that the law needs to be adapted. It's that the conversation needs to be adapted to the law better, I think.
Well, I would say the danger's a little bit more than just the conversation. There are influences on the law that are pushing it in a direction that is much more associated with what we might call law enforcement missions than wartime missions. And so my answer would be, there doesn't need to be an adaptation or evolution of the law. There needs to be resistance to efforts to distort the law in a way that makes it inconsistent with the tradecraft that it was designed to regulate. The tradecraft it was designed to regulate is war, combat, mortal combat, where you bring decisive military power to bear to bring an enemy into submission. And that's complicated when it's a state versus state conflict. It's more complicated when you're fighting a non-state enemy. But the core function of leveraging combat power to achieve a national objective is the same. And that's infliction of damage and destruction on your opponent to achieve your decisive effect. one of the concerns I have is that there are not be careful here. I think that there are many voices in the discourse that know a lot about law that don't know very much about war. They don't understand military operations. They don't understand how strategic objectives are translated into tactical action, and how the law is really designed to facilitate that, not to block it at every turn. So, for example, the law has a vital effect of mitigating the risk to innocent civilians. But if you listen to the discourse, as Laurie just said, it sounds more and more like the law is being presented as having a vital effect of preventing civilian casualties. There is a difference between mitigating risk and preventing risk.
I see.
Preventing is you can't do it. Mitigating is you're judged against a standard that says, did you do what was feasible to reduce unnecessary risk? But if mitigation is the function of the law, it presupposes that there are situations where, unfortunately and tragically, there's no alternative other than to inflict civilian casualties. That's built into the law of war. That's a unique aspect of the law. But the dialogue on the law and the pressures from different entities that are trying to make the law more protective is pushing it in a very different direction. And so that's why Professor Blank and I, or Laurie and I, are such good friends, because we share a common interest, not in wanting to give military commanders license to inflict catastrophic harm for no good reason, but to make people understand that the law has to accommodate the strategic purpose of using force. Otherwise, one of two things is going to happen. Otherwise, the military forces are going to become so constrained that it's going to give the enemy an unjustified windfall in advantage, in protection, or there's going to be a game of lip service to the law, where below the surface it's losing its respect among the people who have to live with it. So they'll say, yeah, we got it. Right? So this whole issue of warnings is a good example. So the IDF makes a good faith effort to issue warnings before attack as best it can under the circumstances. In my estimation, probably the most extensive pre-attack warning campaign I've ever seen, and it gets condemned because they're not good enough. Now, what's going to happen in the future? Either the commanders are going to say, well, I can't attack anybody, or they're going to say,
no warning whatsoever.
No warning. So you're actually having a detrimental effect on the mitigation effort by trying to transform it into a prevention effort.
I see. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
And I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
We'll see you again.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
הרדיו הבינתחומי בשידורים חיים ורעיונות מיוחדים. מהכנס השנתי של ICT, המכון למדיניות נגד טרור.